Someone got very into um, trying to find words from the world of actual beer brewing and assigning them to things. And it can be a little bit overwhelming if you're coming into it to start. So we're going to break down some of that terminology. But if at any point you're like, oh, I've forgotten what this particular thing is, there is a glossary on the Homebrew site that goes through all of the very specific terms. So to start off with, the start of a package. So what you might normally call a package in homebrew land is going to be one of two things. It's going to be a formula or a cask. And we'll start with formula. Formulas are the original homebrew package. These are the definitions for packages that are going to be CLI tools or language runtimes, like developer-y, computer-y things. I'm being a little bit vague about it because the typical distinction is like formula is for like CLI and developer tools, and casks are for GUI apps. But there's not things can be done either way. Binaries can be installed by both. It's like a little bit wishy-washy. But this is kind of the typical distinction. So a formula is a package definition, and it tells Homebrew where to get the assets to install the package. So that might be source code that it will build from source to get the software working on your machine, or it might be a pre-compiled binary, so like a program that's already been compiled and is ready to use on your operating system straight away. It will have the download locations of those. If it's building it from source, it will also tell Homebrew what the dependencies are, which will enable Homebrew to install the dependencies so that it can build the software from source. It will then have instructions for actually doing the source in the building from source, like which compilers to use, which flags to use, etc. If there's any post-build instructions to install the binary, that now that it's done, it will contain those. And finally, it will contain testing steps to check the installation has been successful. You can see here on the right is an actual formula definition. This is for a piece of software that I love called Attune. It is written in Ruby, and that can initially be quite intimidating. Ruby is not as popular programming language as a programming language as it once was, but a really important thing about a lot of the homebrew ecosystem when it comes to interacting with Ruby is, although Ruby is the programming language, they have made declarative simplified syntax at the point where people have to interact with it to define packages. So for both formula and casks, there's it's essentially, it's not much different from writing like a YAML or a JSON configuration file for what, the various places those are needed. It's pretty on rails. You're not really doing a lot of like control flow programming or anything like that. It's more or less just putting in the required blocks that the formula need, and it's a very easy process. And a great thing that we'll come to in a minute is all of the homebrew formula that are in the official tabs are all open source. So you've got this huge library of things to dip into if you ever need to see how something is done. So if you're not a Rubyist, don't worry, that's not going to stop you writing formula. And in fact, a lot of the formula stuff is auto-generated for you by the brew command line, as we'll get into. So just to point out a couple of, actually, I've got this on the next slide. Here we go. I mentioned those formula sources. Formula can contain both the source code and the binary locations. And in homebrew terminology, a precompiled binary is called a bottle. I told you it was going to get silly. So when we install a package, it will either be installed from source, or if a bottle, a precompiled binary, is available, it will be poured from the bottle. So here in the Attune definition, you'll see right at the top there, we've got the URL for the source code in the tar.gz file, but then we also have this block that says bottle do, and it's got a list of the operating systems that someone has compiled, operating systems and platforms, sorry, I should say, that someone has compiled Attune for, so that when someone brew installs Attune, this brew file will say, okay, what operating system are they on? Let's install the right binary. The binaries, that looks a bit weird. You're thinking, okay, that's a SHA-256 hash. That's not a URL. Where are the binaries? Homebrew has really close integration with the GitHub container registry. And so if you're packaged on the GitHub container registry, you can actually just include a SHA rather than a URL, because it will go and automatically find it. But you can also use URLs. So that's important if, for example, you are wanting to distribute packages, like you are wanting to distribute internal tools as binaries and you've got them sat on a server somewhere, you can just point to that URL. That's totally fine. It's just with this package, they're being a bit clever. So other things to note in this screenshot, the testing block, as I mentioned, the testing block is the place where, right there at the bottom, where it is the most kind of arbitrary Ruby code, because you can choose to write the test to see if your package works however you want. You can get as fancy or as basic with it as you want to get, and so that is the only place really in the file where you're getting like into, arbitrary code. The rest of it is very on Rails. We have in def install, so where we're installing the thing. Um, it's basically just the series of shell commands that you want it to run. So yeah, that's a formula. We'll be seeing formulas in a bit when we come to write one or generate one. But before we get onto that, we've got to talk about casks. So casks, as I mentioned, are the alternate package definition. These are typically for large GUI apps such as Google Chrome. These are also in Ruby, but it is slightly different. These files look different. Again, it is a declarative, simplified syntax. You're not really writing Ruby. You're just kind of, it just happens to be in Ruby. The key way of thinking about casks that I find makes them a lot less intimidating is essentially, when you install a GUI app on Mac OS, you download it, you open the installer, and the installer has you drag the little icon of the application into the applications folder. Essentially, casks are just scripting that process, right? Like you're just you've got the URL where the binary is, where the .pkg file is, and you are getting it into the applications folder, and doing any configuration and post installation checks that you need to do. So it looks intimidating at first glance, but it's a very simple process. You're just downloading a binary and moving it to the right location. And much as I said, with much like Formula, there is an official Homebrew cask repository that has loads of existing casks that you can go and check how they're doing things. And those repositories are called taps. So in Homebrew parlance, a repository, usually a GitHub repository. Homebrew does tend to be GitHub centric because of where it's come from. It's an open source ecosystem. You can use other repository providers like GitLab or even something like Forjo or Git, but it will assume GitHub by default. And the path we're going to go on today is GitHub, because we can use the default commands. You are not locked into using GitHub. There are it just basically means that you can't use the happy path. You have to add more flags. You have to do some things manually. But a tap is a repository, usually on GitHub, that contains package definitions. So those will be formulas or casks, as well as often also including the actual release assets itself. So when you're using default Homebrew, so if you're just doing like brew install Python, that is installing from Homebrew core, which is like the official repository of verified Homebrew packages. When we talk about taps, we tend to be talking about third-party repositories. So, for example, here on the screen, this is the Homebrew tap for Universal Blue, for the Bluefin project. This is a tap for stuff that gets installed by default on the Bluefin operating system, which I'm running on right now. So they're actually using a Homebrew tap to distribute software as part of the installation process of the operating system, which is quite a neat usage of it. You will often encounter taps if you go to install some brew software, because as I mentioned, there's quite a high bar to get into the official brew repositories. Sometimes if you're installing a piece of software and it has brew instructions, you might see it will say brew tap and then give you a name to put in to add the tap first so that you can then brew install. An important thing about third-party taps, if you are using them as like a user of Brew, is that obviously they do not have the guarantees that come with Homebrew core. And any tap, could contain a formula that does anything. There's more of a burden on you as the user to read that formula and ensure you know what it's doing with your system and ensure that it's installing what you think it's installing. And if any of you are admins, which given our audience you probably are, one of the things that we hear from our customers is wanting to control which brew taps can be added and which brew taps can be software can be installed from, because they could contain anything. But if you're working on the official Homebrew tap, it's always pretty safe. But third-party taps, much like any install destination, could include software that does anything. Okay,